In this tutorial, we will discuss how to complete the emission unit form in MAERS. Step-by-step form completion instructions can be found in section 4.5 of the MAERS User Guide and Workbook. The emission unit form collects information about the emission units that must be reported in MAERS. Now, before I explain how to complete the form, I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about what an emission unit is and what emission units need to be reported in your MAERS report. Essentially, an emission unit contains one or more process devices, 0 or more control devices, and all the related stacks. One example of an emission unit might be a boiler, its control device, and the associated stack. So here we have a process device, a control device, and a stack, all making up one emission unit. An emission unit also may be as simple as a standalone degreaser. That is just one process device. The Air Quality Division's Operational Memorandum Number 6 contains guidance on how to put all your devices into the proper emission unit groupings. Most of you will not have to worry about identifying emission units though, because this has already been done for you. If you've submitted a MAERS report in the past, all of your emission units will already be entered into the system. You want to make sure that the emission unit IDs that you use match the emission unit IDs that are in your permit. Emission units are also identified in any permits to install that may have been issued to you by the Air Quality Division. Emission units also may appear in your renewable operating permit, if you have one. Once you've identified what emission units are at your facility, the next thing you might ask yourself is whether or not those emission units need to be included in your MAERS report. And it really depends a lot on whether or not the emission unit is considered Rule 201 exempt or not. Let's take a minute and talk about that. Rule 201 of the Michigan Air Pollution Control Rules requires that you obtain a permit to install prior to installing or modifying an emission unit that emits an air contaminant. Rules 280 through 290 of the Michigan Air Pollution Control Rules exempt certain processes and activities from the requirement to obtain a permit to install. There are several exemptions in the rules for things ranging from smaller boilers, coal cleaners, cleaning and ventilation equipment, and some coating operations. So you'll have to check out those exemptions to see whether or not the activity or process is exempt from having to obtain a permit. Now there's also another rule, Rule 278, that excludes some activities from being exempt if the emissions from that unit or activity are considered significant. So essentially Rule 278 excludes some of the larger emitting sources that might fall under an exemption from actually being installed without a permit. Now if you have questions about Rule 201 or whether or not a piece of equipment needs a permit or not, I'd recommend you check out the tutorial that we've developed on Do I Need an Air Permit? So essentially the term Rule 201 exempt emission unit means that it's a unit or activity or process that's been identified in one of the rules 280 through 290 as being exempt from the requirement to obtain a permit. It's also not subject to Rule 278, which might exclude it from being exempt. So how do you know whether or not to include the emission unit in MAERS? Well, the general rule is that if it's not Rule 201 exempt, then you need to include the emission unit in your MAERS report. If the emission unit is Rule 201 exempt, then you have to look at a few more factors to determine whether or not it should be included in your MAERS report. Now if you look at page 29 of the MAERS workbook, it contains some guidelines to help you determine whether or not you should include that unit in your MAERS report. There's also a decision tree, like the one shown on the screen here, that will help you as well. And so as you can see, whether or not it needs to be included really depends on whether it's considered Rule 201 exempt or not. Let's take a minute and take a look at this decision tree. At the top you see we have all of our emission units. Now if you take a look at an emission unit that is not Rule 201 exempt, meaning it's grandfathered from the requirement to obtain a permit because it was installed prior to August 15th, 1967, or perhaps has a permit, or even violating Rule 201. If it's any of those, then it's not Rule 201 exempt, and that unit has to be included in your MAERS report. Now the right side of this decision tree deals with emission units that are Rule 201 exempt. And if you look a little lower, we have to look at whether or not the source has a renewable operating permit, an ROP, or not. If the source does not have a renewable operating permit, then you move down the decision tree and ask yourself certain questions regarding if it's identified in a permit, or if the rule that exempts that emission unit is identified in Table 4-2. And you can see Table 4-2, and as you can see, here's part of Table 4-2 from the MAERS User Guide and Workbook, and it identifies certain rules that exempt activities and processes. And according to the decision tree, you have to take a look at that table, and if the rule that exempts that emission unit is not in the table, then you do not have to report the emission unit. If it is in the table, then you take a look at the criteria in the table to see if it exceeds that criteria. For example, if you have a boiler that's exempt under Rule 282B and it has a total annual throughput equal to or greater than 50 million cubic feet of natural gas, then according to our decision tree, it meets or exceeds the criteria, and so you'd have to report that emission unit. If, in our example here, the throughput for the boiler was less than 50 million cubic feet, it would not meet or exceed the criteria, and you would not have to report that boiler in MAERS. Now, if you do have a renewable operating permit, there's a few extra steps you have to go through, but a lot of them are pretty similar to the non-ROP source steps in terms of taking a look at Table 4-2. The main thing you should realize, though, is that if you have a renewable operating permit and that emission unit is identified in your renewable operating permit, then it must be reported in MAERS. So for example, if you have a coal cleaner that's identified in your renewable operating permit, it does have to be included in your MAERS report. Once you've determined which emission units need to be included in your MAERS report or not, you can complete the emission unit forms. When you click on the emission unit link, you'll see the emission unit list displayed. And just like with the stack form, these are all the emission units that you reported in previous years. To view or edit a particular emission unit record, you can click on the View Edit link. If you want to delete an emission unit record, you can click the Delete link. If you want to delete an emission unit record, there are some guidelines you should adhere to. And when you click the Delete button, you'll be asked a series of questions that'll verify whether or not this emission unit should be deleted or simply marked as dismantled on the emission unit form. If you want to add a new emission unit record, click on the Add a New Emission Unit button. Let's take a look at one of our emission units. As you can see, when you click on it, all the emission unit information will be pre-filled from the previous year. There are some fields, though, that might still need to be completed. So you'll want to make sure after you click on Save, if there are any warnings or errors, you go back and fix those errors. For example, here under capacity information, we see we've identified this emission unit as a combustion source. We've entered a design capacity of, let's say, 80 million BTUs per hour. So we need to make sure we complete the design capacity unit numerator field. Make sure that the denominator field corresponds. And also answer the next question: is this combustion source used to generate electricity? If it isn't, we select no. Now if we save the emission unit record, our error message will disappear. A couple other features I want to show you on this form. Under control devices, you may have a control device already identified here. If you want to delete that control device because perhaps it doesn't exist or it was entered incorrectly, simply click on the delete icon. If you want to add a control device or add a second control device, you click on the plus icon. You'll be given a drop-down box in which you can choose a control device. The same rule is for the emission unit stacks. If you click on the plus icon, a drop-down box will be displayed, and in that drop-down box will be a listing of all the stacks that were identified on the stack form. To delete a stack record, click on the delete icon. Again, as you make changes and edits to the emission unit form, make sure you save them before you move on to another screen. If it's been saved successfully and all the fields that need to be completed are, it'll say saved successfully at the top of the screen. When you're done with this record, click on Back to Emission Unit List to go back to your emission unit list. And you can go back and review the other emission unit records. If you have a new emission unit that needs to be added to your MAERS report, or you have an emission unit that previously wasn't in your MAERS report and now needs to be added, click on Add New Emission Unit. A blank emission unit record will be displayed, and you'll have to complete all the fields. Remember, those fields with a star need to be completed. The MAERS User Guide and Workbook contains step-by-step instructions on how to complete each one of these fields.